PowerPoint and the voiceover discussion about it is going to serve as kind of a review for your CDA. So we're going to talk about medieval Europe. Knights in armor, the Crusades, castles and great cathedrals, the Black Death, the Magna Carta. All of these are part of the historical period we collectively call the Middle Ages, also known as the medieval era, sometimes the Dark Ages. And we've already had that debate. Was it really the Dark Ages? Was it the medieval times? What was it? When was this? How did this period influence the development of Western civilization? We're going to seek to kind of answer these essential questions right here. How did the Germanic kingdoms that took over the Western Roman Empire differ from the society the Romans had organized in that region? What is feudalism, and how did medieval feudalism differ from the political rule by a central authority or state, such as the one that ruled the Roman Empire? What factors help to explain the rise and spread of feudalism in Europe in the Middle Ages? Why was the Catholic Church able to play a unique role in unifying the societies of medieval Europe? And in what ways was medieval Europe influenced and shaped by its interactions with the Muslim societies to its south? What factors caused the crisis and troubles of the late Middle Ages? So when we look at defining this medieval period, there's some debate concerning the beginning and the end of the medieval period. Just like anything that we talk about in history, it's someone's interpretation of what happened based on the evidence that they have. So historians usually place the medieval era from approximately 500 CE or AD to 1500 CE or AD, depending on what you want to call it, or the period of between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. So that's generally the time period that we call the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the medieval times. Europe during this time has also been called Middle Ages. This refers to the fact that it is a time situated between the classical Europe that we talked about, the Romans Empire, the time that we think that life was the best, and which is the Renaissance is going to attempt to bring that back, and the more modern times. Medieval comes from the Latin word medium aevum, which translates as the middle period or Middle Ages. And the Dark Ages, this term was used in the 15th and 16th centuries by those who believed that the era lacked social or artistic worth. Somewhat an unfair criticism, and historians generally avoid using this overtly judgmental term. And again, we've had that debate. Was it really the Dark Ages, and whose interpretation is that? So there's different stages of medieval Europe. We have the early, the high, and the late. And these are the three time periods that it's generally broken up into. And each are distinctive by major civilization-changing events that happened. The early Middle Ages was after the fall of the Roman Empire. Small independent kingdoms are going to arise throughout Western Europe. And this era also witnesses the birth of feudalism, a system of sovereignty and protection, which we're going to later discuss in this presentation. The High Middle Ages. So during this era, Christianity becomes a dominant force, uniting Western Europe under the authority of the Catholic Church. And the Crusades are going to occur during this time, allowing territorial leaders to bring diverse groups together and command authority by ordering people to defend their beliefs against the mounting threat of Islam. And then the late Middle Ages, this era is going to be characterized by the decline of feudalism and the rise of nation-states that are ruled by royal families. Events during this time also include the 100 Years' War, the spread of the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, which is going to kill 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe. Again, a number that's subject to debate. So let's start at the beginning, the fall of the Roman Empire. What has been referred to as the fall of the Roman Empire marks the beginning of this medieval era, and it also contributed to the social and political climate of Europe for centuries afterwards. Historians also note that the Roman Empire, especially the city of Rome, fell for multiple reasons. And again, we've discussed these reasons in class. One of the major reasons being invasions. One of the most significant reasons, the barbaric invasions. Rome was under constant threat of invasion from all sides. And as the Roman Empire grew, it became increasingly harder for them to protect their outside territory. So these Germanic tribes from North Central Europe, the Huns from Asia, the African tribes in the south, um, are going to invade into Rome, and several barbarian tribes eventually attack, particularly in the west. These Germanic invaders from the north are going to take land as far south as Greece, and Rome is going to be sacked by the Visigoths in 410 and by the Vandals in 455, and finally in 476, these Germanic invaders are going to overthrow the last of the Roman emperors, thus ending the traditional what we think of as the Roman Empire. Let's take a closer look at these barbaric invaders. The founders of Europe's future nations are going to settle in this European mainland during the early medieval period. These invaders come from Asia, namely from the Huns and the Magyars and Germanic tribes, including the Saxons, the Angles, and the Goths. They're going to become less nomadic and create permanent settlements in Europe. Many of these kingdoms are going to be short-lived and unstable, but they mark a new era of European development of population centers that are away from Rome. And here is a map of Europe in about 814. And I know you guys are working on a map and realize that throughout this time in history, this map is going to change a great deal. The rise of the Germanic peoples. After the Germanic invasions, Rome influence is going to merge with this Germanic culture and people in different ways. And the Ostrogoths, who are on the Italian peninsula, preserve Roman government structure and traditions. And the Visigoths, located in modern-day Spain, are going to keep Roman traditions but install Germanic leaders. And in the British Isles, the Angles and the Saxons are going to carve out portions to create their own kingdoms. And the strongest of the Germanic tribes are going to be the Franks. And they're located in Central Europe, and they gain much of their strength under the leadership of Clovis and Charlemagne. Probably a name that you recognize, and we're going to revisit in a little bit. Let's first talk about Clovis. From 466 to 511, and drawing over here. In 486, the Franks defeat the last major Roman army in Gaul, which is present-day France. I'm pretty sure I had you locate that on your map. And then they're going to subdue other tribes and minor rulers in the area to establish the first Frankish kingdom. Clovis is going to be the first Frankish king. He had a brilliant military career and dramatically expanded the holdings of his empire through battles, both with competing tribes and remaining regional Roman political leaders. And during his reign, he's going to convert to Christianity, supposedly after praying to Jesus during a battle. And this is going to help establish bonds with Christians now under his rule through military conquest. So after the death of Clovis, Charles Martel is going to become the leader of the Franks, and he continues to expand and defend the Frankish kingdom, including the defeat of the Muslim invaders in 732. And after his death, his son Pepin the Short is what history calls him, is going to ask the head of the church, Pope Zacharias, to recognize him as king. Well, the Pope agrees, and Pepin becomes the first Frankish king to rule with the blessing from the Pope, or the papal blessing. So Pepin will rule until 768. His successor is going to be Charles, and he'll continue the relationship between the Frankish kingdom and the church, and even expand the kingdom even further. Let's talk about the rule of Charlemagne from 742 to 814. Pepin's son, Charles, becomes the leader of the largest empire since the Romans, known as Charlemagne or Charles the Great. He was also a fierce military leader who sought to expand the Frankish Empire. The vast new territory he creates becomes known as the Carolingian Empire. During his rise to power, Charlemagne was summoned by Pope Leo III, who crowns him Emperor of the Romans, or what would become known as the Holy Roman Emperor, uniting the Roman, Christian, and Germanic cultures and traditions. So when we talk about who the first Holy Roman Emperor was, we're going to need to remember the name of Charlemagne. So let's look at the conquest of Charlemagne. After he defeats the Lombards to the south, the Saxons to the north, and the Slavs to the east, after Charlemagne's death, his empire is going to quickly fall apart as his grandsons are going to fight one another for control of the empire. Powerful local nobles are going to control the land interests throughout Europe, leading to decentralization of power. Adding to the disorder are going to be constant raids carried out by the Scandinavian warriors, also known to us as the Vikings. Okay, that's when we first start seeing the Vikings venturing out into these territories and their conquest. And so let's look very briefly at the Vikings. The Vikings were a warrior culture from Scandinavia. Hailing from these areas we now know as Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, the Norse cultures, the Scandinavian parts. Scholars agree about the reasons why the Vikings began to aggressively raid other cultures and settle lands. Overcrowding and the Viking homelands forced them to seek new territory. Crop failures and a desire to find new trade outlets may have also been factors. We also know that they even made it into North America when we look at the East Coast before the Pilgrims arrived, before Columbus arrives. We know that the Vikings had made contact with North America, but for whatever reasons, permanent settlements did not last. They end up as far south as the Mediterranean, as far east as modern-day Russia, and again, as far west as modern-day Iceland, Greenland, even Canada. And they're going to overrun a large area of northwestern France and call it Norseman land, or later what we'll call Normandy. Some of the invasions of the Vikings. Charlemagne's heirs are going to have difficulty maintaining law and order in the kingdom's fragmented territories. Because they can't get along, there's going to be a difficulty of governing these territories. And the Vikings are going to gain footholds in these areas of the Carolingian Empire. And though they have success in the 9th century, venturing into European mainland, the Vikings are eventually going to lose their edge on the growing kingdoms of Europe. And as these kingdoms develop new and more effective ways to organize and defend themselves against these attacks from these Norsemen, these Vikings from the north. Let's look at some discussion questions. I advise you to write these down so we can look at the answers in class, make sure that you're understanding what we're talking about here, and you can ask questions as needed. So the first one, the Middle Ages are seen as a time between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Renaissance. Why do you think many historians see these events especially as marking the start and the end of an age? Some historians criticize the concept of labeling the centuries a middle age between two other times rather than giving them a name of their own. Why do you think that is? Number 2, the Romans often refer to the Germanic peoples who invaded and undermined the empires as barbarian tribes. Why do you think they referred to these groups as barbarians? And how justified were they in describing the tribes this way? The Middle Ages have also been called the Dark Ages, especially the first 5 centuries or so after the fall of Rome. What about this period do you think has led many to do this? And do you think this label is useful as a way of understanding this era? Why or why not?